pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day. I have spoken of him before, saying he goes about in disguise as a mild-mannered reporter working for a great metropolitan newspaper. But what he does in that phone booth has become all too obvious to many people. He is certainly a troublemaker. And much of what he published is not publishable these days in any great metropolitan newspapers or any medical journals. He was for many years the editor of Postgraduate Medicine, so most of the physicians here are probably familiar with his work. He published an article on strategic missile defense some years ago, which I wrote, and I don't know that the article is particularly distinguished, except that it's probably the only medical journal in the country that has an article on strategic missile defense, although mostly it is about just medicine. I first met Dr. Griffin personally in Washington, D.C., and he was kind enough to allow me to tag along with him when he testified against the appointment of Dr. Joycelyn Elders as Surgeon General. And as you know, his opinion on this subject was certainly vindicated. He now is the editor of a small journal called Collegium Aesculapium. He's the author of 6 books and 2 new books. One was called Good Fat, Bad Fat, and will be retitled Heart Insurance. He also is writing a book called Getting Through to Children and Getting Through to Teens. He is immensely well qualified for today's subject, being the father of 6 and the grandfather of 13. He is the coordinator for the Pediatric Education Program of the Utah Valley Family Practice Association. He is, of course, a pediatrician. He is on the advisory board of the Medical Institute for Sexual Health, which is not what you think. It's put out. He has helped to create some national guidelines which will compete with some of those which are rather more widely used. One of the great disasters of our days, we believe, is taking place in the public schools, not only from the cultural standpoint, but from the epidemiological standpoint, and that will be the subject of his address today. There is a piece of investigative reporting included in your packets. He has actually looked into some of the ideas that Joycelyn Elders was propounding and the results of these ideas. Dr. Glen Griffin.
Thanks, Jane. It is so good to be with you here today, and it's great to be introduced as a troublemaker in these very troubling times in Washington and all over America. This is a little creek that just runs a few hundred yards from our home down here in Mapleton, Utah. And this little creek is filled with giardia and with all kinds of other contaminants. And here's a little clear pool that looks absolutely marvelous near our mountain home. And one of my little side battles over the years in pediatrics has been to try to teach scout leaders and other wilderness people how important it is to boil water and not just drink wonderful, clear-looking water that's filled with these parasites and other organisms, because these waters look so good. And this is one of the problems that we have. There's so many things around us that look so good and that are filled with such contaminants and so many problems. And what's filling our kids' heads is even a bigger problem than the giardia that we have in the water that's in that creek. In America today, the progress of sexually transmitted diseases is one of the big disasters. Can you focus that just a little bit, Jeremy? When many of us were practicing, not many years ago, syphilis and gonorrhea were it as far as sexually transmitted diseases. They were bad, but that was the extent of the ticket almost, except for the moral corruption of the people who were involved. All of a sudden, though, now we have just an unfolding number, a whole parade of sexually transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, chlamydia and HIV and herpes, and it just goes on and on and on. And then in 1990, here comes penicillin-resistant strains of gonorrhea. And then in 1991, the papillomavirus became recognized to be a bigger and bigger problem. And in 1992, syphilis peaked at a 40-year high. By the next year, in 93, pelvic inflammatory disease was just spreading rampant. And more tubal pregnancies. 600% increase from 1970 to 1995. Mostly from chlamydia and gonorrhea. 20 to 25 significant STDs and 12 million newly infected people each year. Look at this statistic. 1 in 5 Americans between 15 and 55 is now infected with a viral STD. And of course, we can't do very much about them after they are infecting people. Syphilis is a devastating disease for newborns. It's certainly devastating for adults. It affects organs all over the body. Rather gruesome. More gruesome. Gonorrhea, which back in World War II and Korean War years was commonly just laughed off as clap, because people would get a shot of penicillin, a little bit of medication, and it would be contained. But now we have strains of resistant gonorrhea, which are more and more of a disaster. Herpes. Can you imagine that a quarter of all Americans will get herpes by the age of 30? Can we focus that in a little bit more, Jeremy? It looks like this focus kind of wobbles. And people can become infected even when the sex partner doesn't have any noticeable sores.
Dr. Griffin?
Yes?
Does that include herpes simplex around the mouth?
No, we're just talking about genital herpes here. Which is, of course, totally different. But once a person becomes infected with genital herpes, this is a lifetime experience of off and on disease. Not very pleasant picture to start the day of looking at genital herpes. And think about these consequences of genital herpes in pregnancy. That the baby has a 40 to 50% chance of becoming infected. And think about this. Once a baby's infected with genital herpes, has a 60% chance of dying. And then half of the ones that don't die are severely brain damaged. And here's the papillomavirus causing the so-called genital or venereal warts. 30% or more of many groups of sexually active single people have this human papillomavirus. And here it is affecting the cervix. What a disaster this is a precancerous lesion, and also leading to infertility and other problems. Chlamydia, the big cause of pelvic inflammatory disease today. 20 to 40% of some groups of sexually active singles have this. Wow. Just one disaster after another. Now here, some normal fallopian tubes. Now look at this next picture that shows them infected with pelvic inflammatory disease. No wonder there's so many tubal pregnancies. And here's some adhesions caused by this organism between the diaphragm and the liver. No wonder so many young women are having chronic abdominal pain. And then there's hepatitis B. Very, very prevalent sexually transmitted disease these days. It's often passed from the mother to the newborn. And look at this, 70 to 90% of infected babies become lifelong infectious carriers. They often develop cirrhosis and cancer. And then there's HIV and AIDS. AIDS always results in death, 100%. Million or more Americans infected by 92, and a lot more already by now. Leading cause of death for people aged 25 to 44. People get HIV, they're going to be infected till they die, and they'll be contagious the rest of their life. And what a miserable life and a miserable death. The consequences of which are totally unnecessary. But your government and mine has sponsored public service announcements to explain to the people of America, especially the kids, to use condoms to avoid these problems, supposedly. And these messages are just touted on radio and especially on television. You see little condoms dancing across the screen. You see passionate people getting ready to get in bed with each other. And the whispery, sensual voice says, "Did you bring it?" And the guy said, "No, I forgot." And then she says, "Well, forget it." Well, the message about forgetting it's a good idea, but how about forgetting it altogether if they're not married? And what's so bad about talking about waiting for sex until marriage? What has this country come to, where it becomes unpopular to talk about waiting for marriage for sex? This is a pattern that has prevailed over all the history of the world, 4,000 years or however long. That sex is good, it's wholesome, it's great for marriage. But here, our government pays and has spent millions of dollars on this campaign that enables people to mess around and play around with sex by using condoms. And it really encourages them to play around with sex. Well, this is garbage. This is bad information. It is misinformation as far as I'm concerned, because the whole principle is medically flawed. For goodness sakes, we get enough commercials for sex, watching movies, television, novels, books, magazines, where the whole premise of many of these stories is about people popping in and out of bed with each other. We get way too much of this anyway. But then we turn around and have our government put on commercials for a condom program that's not only morally flawed, but medically flawed. It's just bad information. And here in our schools all across America, the kids are getting this message repeatedly. Now, can you imagine here, the leaders that youth look up to get their information, so many of them are giving them the exact message of the enemy, of the opposition. It's unbelievable. Well, I went down to Little Rock to cover the transition team when the present administration came into power right after the election, before they actually went to Washington. That was quite an experience. I had my press passes and went to the news conferences and the briefings, and I was trying to figure out who would be likely appointed to the different positions in relationship to the health professions, or Surgeon General, the Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary for Health, and other key positions. Well, I pretty well figured out that the Arkansas Director of Health would be appointed to some position. So I decided it'd be a good idea to just look into this a little bit. And I'd heard something about school clinics in Arkansas, but I didn't know a whole lot about them. So I called from the Presidential Transition Team Office to the Department of Health in Arkansas and explained that I was the editor of a major medical journal and I'd be interested in coming over and getting some information. Well, Dr. Elders wasn't in, but they assured me that they would provide briefings for me. And so I went over to the Arkansas Department of Health and was briefed and explained about the school clinics. They treated me like royalty. Maybe they thought I was in line for a cabinet position post or something in the new administration, since I'd called from there, even though I'd explained that I was the editor of a medical journal. But anyway, they gave me a guide to take me over to see the school clinics. So we went over to the junior high school, Forest Heights Junior High School. And I went in, and here's a school nurse and a psychologist, and my guide, who was a nurse practitioner, and it was interesting to see these little rooms in this junior high school clinic. And I was kind of naive. Somebody said that I'm kind of like Columbo, that kind of think slowly sometimes. And I said, well, what do you do when you get a kid in here that has a sore throat? Do you do a fast strep test, or do you do a throat culture? In school, they said, oh no, we don't do those kind of things. I said, well, what do you do? Well, we send them to their doctor. Well, I had just been briefed at the Arkansas Department of Health as to why these school clinics existed. And one of the main messages was that half of the kids didn't have doctors, and so they had to have the clinics in the schools. And so I said, well, if you don't take care of their sore throats, what do you do? Well, you know, a lot of them come from broken homes, and some of them drink, and some of them use drugs, and some of them are pregnant, and we have too many pregnant kids. So I was just catching on as to what this thing was all about. I don't care about kids with sore throats. That isn't the purpose of school clinics. The real purpose of school clinics is to take care of pregnancies, to avoid pregnancies, and if they get pregnant, to have abortions. This is the ultimate purpose, is, in my opinion, of most, if not all, school clinics in America. The nurse then proudly told me that they gave their students, these are junior high kids now, middle school kids. They gave them a choice between birth control pills, condoms, and 5-year implants. They gave the girls their choice. Little girls. And then she quickly explained that they couldn't put the implants in there in the junior high or write out the prescription for the contraceptive pills because it was against that particular school board's rules. But she quickly assured me, but don't worry because they get them because we send them down to the mall clinic. The mall clinic, is that run by the state? Oh yes, that's run by the state of Arkansas. So now let me see if I've got this straight. You're funded and staffed partially by Arkansas Department of Health people, yes. The mall clinic is staffed by Arkansas Department of Health people, yes. It's against the school board rules to give these kids these things. So you send them down to the mall clinic so you can get around the rules. And that was essentially it. Well, I went over the next trip to Little Rock, to the Little Rock Central High School. And they didn't have so many restrictions there in the high school clinic. This was a fascinating experience. So I walked in, here was this big waiting room in this clinic. Now this is kind of down the street from the science labs, from the computer labs, from the math class, and kind of get the idea of putting this clinic in here that adds the message to the kids that this is approved just like math and science and English and everything else. All the other school programs that parents take care of must be okay because here it is right there in the school. So you walk into this waiting room in Little Rock Central High School, school clinic, and it's kind of a gathering place. It reminds you something of kids gathering together at a 7-Eleven in the evening, or at a mall, or at a Burger King, or some other place where kids kind of hang out. Well, this is kind of a hangout place. It was very warm and friendly. Everybody, big smiles, nice receptionist. It gave the appearance of a very friendly doctor's office, only one that was just specially made for teenagers. There's one other thing that's probably a little different than your office, because there were big posters on the wall promoting condoms. Here's one little poster that is something like it. You know, this poster here says "good things," and then "cum" is written inside the condom in condoms. Good things come in condoms. These posters are shocking to me. As I looked at these things and sat there and just pondered what was going on, because the message all along was use condoms. And the whole message of the program seemed to me to be, kids, play around with sex, do anything, just don't get pregnant. Well, here I picked up this little comic book because I asked if I could tour the clinic, and they were so busy that I was told to just sit down and wait. So I sat down and picked up this little comic book from a stack of comic books on the little table there. Andrea and Lisa. Now, the comic book opens up. The problem here, Andrea says, well, Lisa, does your boyfriend really use a rubber when you have sex? We focus it a little bit, Jeremy. No, I'm on the pill. Well, you can see there's a problem here. So the comic book goes along this discussion between Andrea and Lisa. And you'll be happy to know maybe that the concluding part of this comic book is that the fairy god sister comes and convinces these girls to be sure to always use rubbers when they have sex. This is in a public high school. This is the message that the kids were getting. Unbelievable. Well, here was another pamphlet that I picked up in the Central High School waiting room. I need to focus it again. Here's this pamphlet that says, Safe Sex for Men and Women Concerned About AIDS. What is safer sex? And then it tells you here about this. Sex without taking risks. Now look at the list of things under here that this pamphlet says are safe acts. Remember, using a condom makes almost everything safer. Mutual masturbation, hugging, caressing, fondling, cuddling, kissing, fantasy, movies, pictures, sex toys that are not used in common, intercourse if a condom is used properly, oral sex if a condom is used. Safe acts. These are things that the kids are told to do. And here's the back page of the pamphlet. It's that easy? That's right. Safer sex means protecting yourself and your partner. Take simple precautions. Go steady, use condoms. You'll never forget the feeling of safer sex. Misinformation. First place, will people use condoms? Well, repeated studies of kids 15 to 19 years, they really don't use them very regularly. And the ones that supposedly are targeted the most, the inner city kids, use them even less. Well, how about the kids on the birth control pills? In fact, this was a question I asked the school nurse in the Forest Heights Junior High School. I said, well, wait a minute. If you give them their choice between condoms and pills and Norplans, I said, the pill doesn't protect them at all for AIDS. This is a 100% killer. I asked Joyce on Elders this directly face-to-face later in a press conference at the American Academy of Pediatrics, and she was just totally flustered. She just couldn't handle that question. We try to get them to use condoms too, the school nurse had told me. But look at this. Only 3% of the women on birth control pills also use condoms. Now, think about this for a minute. Are the folks who are running these clinics and who are running this kind of SICA-sponsored sex education in America, are they really interested in preventing AIDS or preventing chlamydia or herpes, genital herpes, or all these other sexually transmitted diseases? If they're giving the kids a choice between condoms and pills and Norplans, And the reason they're giving them their choice is because the kids don't like or don't use condoms very regularly. So they get them on the pill, but 93% of them, or 97% of them, don't use condoms too. To me, that kind of means that they really don't care about AIDS, which is a 100% killer. They really don't care so much. And ask the question, will condoms really prevent AIDS? Look how many married couples, when one partner was HIV infected, 17% of the previously uninfected partners became HIV positive in 18 months. The risk there was 1 in 6. Russian roulette. Chlamydia, not very well protected, maybe 50% protection with condoms and chlamydia. And herpes, not much protection at all. Well, when we talk to kids, I'll often get my gas mask out. Do you want to come up here for a minute? Yeah. Here's, this is a pretty neat gas mask. What's your name?
Hans.
Hans. Great, good to meet you. Would you like to try that on there? Is that?
This will probably fit.
Yeah. That's kind of fun, isn't it? Do you like that, Hans?
Yeah.
That feel pretty good? Now, Hans, there is a heck of a party going on down the street. And the only problem is that at this party, there's some poison gas in the house. And how would you feel about going to this party wearing my gas mask?
It might be a little bit safer, I don't know.
Is it safer at home? Yeah, I forgot to tell you that there's some nut over there taking some pot shots with a pistol too. Not terribly safe. Now, Hans, if I did convince you that this gas mask was a good idea to go to that party, and you knew that 19 or 20% of the time that the gas mask failed, would you go? Could I convince you to go?
No, I'd say probably not.
How about if I paid you $100? Would you go to that?
No, I'd say probably not.
Hans, you're a smart guy. See, you and American kids are smart, and they understand and they get it. But when they're getting a stupid message at school and on television and from a Surgeon General who's an idiot, with role models like the couple we have in the White House, the kids are just getting plain wrong information. School-based clinics just get F. Birth rates fluctuate dramatically one year to the next, but the school-wide birth rates were not lower in the years following the opening of the St. Paul, Minnesota clinics. And I visited the St. Paul, Minnesota clinic, school-based clinic, and among other things I saw on the walls were notices of support group meetings for gay and lesbian students, and sponsored, of course, by the school. But they also had very friendly people there. They had racks of information. I didn't see an Andrea and Lisa pamphlet there. I did not see one single bit of literature in either the St. Paul or the Little Rock school clinics that would suggest or talk really about waiting to have sex until marriage. There were none that I saw. Well, I asked the school nurse in the St. Paul Minnesota clinic, if she could explain to me or tell me about birth rates or pregnancy rates that were going on at the time, and how many of them had abortions. Oh, we don't know these things. We just don't know. We don't keep those kind of records. You should see the record system they had. I mean, it looked like, again, like a very well-run doctor's office where there were medical charts and records all over the place, but they just absolutely couldn't tell me, just didn't know. Significant information like that wasn't there. Well, here was the Clinton plan for socializing America. 1,364 pages of blueprint for socialism. It was an absolute total disaster buried in here. One place after another were adolescent health measures, talking about school clinics, reproductive health programs, all kinds of stuff that most Americans didn't realize were in here. And now as we read in today's paper that the House passed the new so-called bipartisan health bill that gives real short shrift to medical saving accounts. Can't believe it. 750,000 policy people will be allowed to have medical saving account policies. And as Jane told me the other night, that the provisions of the medical saving accounts in that bill are so watered down that it doesn't give people very much advantage anyway. It's just a disaster. And we don't know what else is in the bill that the House passed, and probably the Senate. I haven't heard if they knocked it out during the night or this morning, but the president's sure to sign it. And we don't have any idea of what other sleepers are in this bill, because as with this, nobody read it. But with the bill that's there, that's apparently going to be signed, we don't know many of the provisions because they weren't in either the House or the Senate version, and they were just kind of slipped in at conference committee time. This particular piece of legislation here, I had the opportunity to brief Newt Gingrich and others about this and the sleepers in it. But as I went and visited many of the people on Capitol Hill, almost nobody had read this. Nobody reads these bills, like Jane so well said in her Wall Street Journal editorial. And that's one of the reasons we get such lousy provisions. But as people read into the morning papers across America today, and they talk about medical saving accounts being in here, if you don't really understand and know how bad the provisions are, you think, oh, well, great, we got this. We got what we wanted. This was one of my editorials, a skunk and gift wrapping, something that looks good, just like that nice bubbly creek that we saw the picture of. It looks good, but it's filled with bad stuff. School-based clinics are definitely not the answer. They don't work. I don't know if you remember seeing the movie about one of the World War II incidents. I think it was in the movie A Bridge Too Far. There was a sequence that told about the historical event of how the Germans had put some of their English-speaking troops in American uniforms, and in fact disguised them, gave them MP bands, and they took over a particular site where there was a road going one way to Amblev and another way to Malmedy. And when our troops came to that point, enemy troops disguised in American MP uniforms were directing traffic. And what they did was they switched the direction of the signs and directed our troops to go exactly the opposite way of where they wanted to go. This was a pretty flagrant trick, and it was very effective in disrupting our battle plan right at that time, or our troop movement. Well, tragically and almost unbelievably, our kids are getting misdirection and misinformation in school every day. Sex education in America was based on the Swedish model. In the first 5 years of the Swedish model of comprehensive sex education, where they're talking about especially the mechanics and about pills and condoms, the pregnancy rate went up by 60% during that first 6 years. You flood these kids with all this stuff and then wonder why they go around and play around with sex. What's happening in America now? Well, a number of years ago, I got one of the first editions of this book. In fact, I was writing a syndicated newspaper column at the time, and so I was on the mailing list to get books to review. And this came to my medical office and in the mail, and I picked it up and looked at it. Well, that looks like an interesting book, kind of colorful. So I started looking at it, and I was so shocked and so engrossed in this that people were waiting and waiting and waiting to see me, and my wife was very frustrated. She was my office nurse at the time, and she came in and she, "Come on, we gotta see patients, they're waiting." Well, let me show you why I was so absorbed in this thing. Here are just a few clips. Sharpen that up. Okay. Well, anyway, one of the messages was that people kind of have to evaluate, and kids have to evaluate their own information, and that they're not going to pay much attention to parents. And it's talking about the virginity that a lot of people feel guilty about breaking. And they go on to talk about not really being a good idea to pay very much attention to parents because they're kind of old and have out-of-date ideas. The book is exceedingly effective in getting across their message, because what they've done is take little vignettes through the whole book with a paragraph here, paragraph there, saying Andrea from a 15-year-old Andrea said this, or Dorothy, a 16-year-old from San Francisco, says this. And some of these quotes that go through a little paragraph at a time give the message how fun it is to play around with sex. Can we try to focus that in just a little bit more? Okay, here. The first time I was getting ready to take my clothes off in front of my boyfriend, I was a little nervous. But I was thinking, now you can see what I really look like. I guess you could say I'm proud of my body. And as Katie said, at first when me and my boyfriend got together, we just got into sex without really looking at each other. It was quick and sort of embarrassing, and neither of us got much out of it. But now it's so neat, we spend time checking each other out, looking at each other. You know, I know there's some young people here today, and even if there weren't young people here today, I'd be embarrassed to show you this stuff or to read you this stuff. And I just hate to contaminate your minds with this kind of garbage. But what I hope you will know is that there is such bad misinformation out there that I hope you'll take a look at this and then put this garbage aside forever and think about what life is really about with a very special marriage partner. Because sex is good and wholesome and wonderful in marriage, and it's fake and counterfeit when people just play around with it and sleep around like this book is talking about. And here we're talking about oral sex. These kids are talking about this and saying that maybe this one kid said that this is very rewarding. Another kid jumped into the conversation and said, well, maybe you ought to tell them to brush their teeth afterward. Now here is a real shocker. If the others weren't. You may not want to have oral sex at all, and that's fine, but if you do, you don't have to worry about dirtiness. All you have to do is wash yourself with soap and water. As Nancy said, if you're going to try oral sex for the first time, you should be clean. If you're going to act with someone you care about, you decide you want to try again, and it talks about smells and things. Where are these people? I mean, for goodness sakes, we're talking about an age when there are AIDS and just washing with water, soap and water. If I wrote this, I'd be sued for medical malpractice. And if it were taught in the public schools, why aren't people being sued for educational malpractice for our kids? Absolutely wrong, bad, lousy information. Here you're talking about how great the pill is. And this goes on and on. Where did this stuff come from? Well, for one thing, there are guidelines put out by the Sexual Information Educational Council of the United States called SICUS, whom I've been a troublemaker for and battling for over 20 years. But this outfit has set themselves up, along with Planned Parenthood and others, to create guidelines for teaching sex education in public schools. And most places all over the country where sex education is taught utilize these guidelines. I mean, they certify sex education teachers. They set up the criteria of what ought to be taught. And some of the stuff that I was reading to you out of that other pamphlet of other alternatives for sex are promoted and taught in here, talking about everything from mutual masturbation to oral sex to all kinds of these other things. This is all part of the SICUS program. Now here we see a community action kit that is put out by SICUS to help counteract those of us who are trying to explain that this may not be a good idea. And this community action kit has one of the pamphlets in it, Winning the Battle. And they tell people how to mobilize their forces so that those of us who think that kids ought to be abstinent until they're married, in other words, they try to dilute out what we're talking about. Now here is their fact sheet on sexual orientation and identity, and you can imagine what that talks about. Now here is a comparison put out by SICUS in their kit, showing comprehensive sex education and what they call fear-based education, which is what they call teaching kids to be abstinent. They say this is fear-based, you're just scaring them, which is totally wrong interpretation anyway, because what we're trying to do is tell kids that sex is great in marriage. And yes, there are things to be afraid about, but there's also some things like trust and mutual respect in marriage that just doesn't happen. But they kind of make light and make fun of traditional values. Look at this, the far right in fear-based abstinence-only programs. And since we've been talking about abstinence programs, and these now are working in many parts of the country, really good programs going. Can you believe that the Seekers message is now, well, we'll talk about abstinence, of course, just like Joyce and Elders did, and as I talked to her, well, we try to teach the children to be abstinent. So I'll give an abstinent sentence, and then, but if you're not going to be abstinent, of course, you want to take condom on every date. And a mixed message doesn't work anymore or any better than if you or I sat down at the dinner table with our kids or grandkids and said, well, now kids don't ever steal a car, but if you steal a car, be sure to wear a seatbelt. I don't know how many things in your medical textbooks you found are wrong. I remember when we were talking about how many chromosomes there are in the human cell, and that was wrong in my high school biology book. There are a lot of mistakes in medicine today, and especially when it's medicine by committee, which is a whole other story. I hate medicine by committee, managed care, which is the business of managed care is to manage to give less care. But medicine by committee is too political and makes a lot of mistakes. But there's an alternative. Here's an alternative that we just produced. The Medical Institute for Sexual Health put out this national guidelines for sexuality and character education. How astonishing, how unpolitically correct or politically incorrect character education. Much is wrong, but look what Eunice Kennedy Shriver said. To do something helpful about teenage sex and pregnancy, we don't need more money for the mechanics of birth control or more value-free, I like to use value-less sex education. We need efforts that strengthen the family commitment in marriage and get at the problems that lead adolescents into early sexual activity. These kids are great. They're terrific. And they need to know that it's perfectly normal and proper and healthy to wait until marriage for sex. Dr. Richard Wetzel, who's a family physician out in California, has written an excellent book, manuscript of which I just read. And he said something very profound. He said, having premarital sex is the most fundamental mistake that an adolescent can make. Having premarital sex is the most fundamental mistake an adolescent can make. Well, Dr. Wetzel also said a couple of other things about misinformation. One of the things he said is that misinformation message number one is that people, especially men, have specific genital sexual needs. And this is wrong. This is just myth. Certainly sex can feel good, but it's not a need. But when people think it's a need, and when they're told by the Surgeon General of the United States and teachers in schools that sex is a need, that they got to have it now, or whenever they want to, it feels good, then the message is, well, if it's a need, I might as well, or I got to do it. Everybody else is doing it. Well, that's one bit of misinformation. Another is that sex is an acceptable form of recreation for kids. It just plain isn't. And certainly we should teach values. There's another little book besides the one I was telling you about before. It's primarily for high school age kids, junior high kids. Here's one that you may find in your grade schools, because this is a book that's called It's Perfectly Normal. And it's actually recommended by Ann Landers. Right here on the cover it says, "At last, a book for young people about sex and reproduction in language they can understand, plus pictures they will enjoy." Well, what do you think this book for little children says? This is a very popular book. It's been talked about here in our communities, and it's in the libraries here. It's all over the country. On page 68 shows a boy matter-of-factly putting on a condom. The title of chapter 27 reads, "Scientists are working day and night." Well, it's fine to be working day and night to find a cure for AIDS. I'm pleased about that. But it sounds like there's nothing we can do other than to let them play around with sex and using a condom until there's a cure for AIDS. We already know how to prevent AIDS. Why isn't that talked about in this book? We don't have to wait for them to find a cure to give better advice than on page 81, where it talks about people having sex involving the penis and vagina, the penis and anus, or mouth and genitals. It says if these are done with someone who has HIV and doesn't protect himself or herself correctly and every time, there's a real risk for getting AIDS. And then it goes on to say if a person chooses to have sex using a latex or polyurethane condom with a water-based lubricant, can help him protect him or her from getting HIV. Now this is for little children. Notice among the factors that influence the first intercourse among teenage men, those who are taught a lot about biology and sex in these ways and about birth control in schools, they have an increased incidence of early sexual intercourse. Those that are taught values, have strict parents, have less. The teens do respond to being taught about abstinence. They listen, they're smart, like Hans. There's a great program going on in Washington, D.C., right in the heart of the inner city, by Elaine Bennett, who's former Secretary Bob Bennett's wife. And Elaine Bennett set up this best friend program, junior high program. And among hundreds of kids who have gone through this, I think there was only one of these kids that became pregnant. Best friend safety rules. Lines girls hear these days, and then how to counteract it. 20 ways to fight peer pressure. This program works. It works so well that now they've got best friends programs in 6 or 7 other schools. And spending time with kids is really important. Here, these national guidelines for sexuality and character education are available, and I hope that you will get this message to the people in the school boards in your community. There's an 800 number here, 800-892-9484, and ask them to send you information about these national guidelines, because these guidelines focus on character, focus on teaching kids about abstinence, and helping kids to build their own self-confidence and ability to handle life's big decisions and choices. Can you imagine having a value of the month in a class at school? Wouldn't that be great? Here, among the very first component of sexual education is character education and responsibility, and talking about sexual urges and desires and the reasons to wait. And here is a page in the guidelines book that is of great value. It's worth its weight in gold. This is a sample policy statement for school boards. And it goes through and explains what criteria should be involved in sex education programs. And the final sentence says, "Be it resolved that any such program be consistent with the attached national guidelines for sexuality and character education." And if they have this book, and if your school board has a program based on these guidelines, your kids are going to get right information instead of mixed information. Medical Institute for Sexual Health, based on science, built on character, bridged through education, and we call it the new sexual revolution. All along, we're teaching kids about sex from the time they're infants on up, and the best sex education is at home, where we're building tree houses, going on camping trips, and doing fun things with our kids. And I hope that those of you who have kids at home or grandkids will take some time out and do some one-to-one time with them, not necessarily going in the kayak and say, okay, we're going to talk about sex. You go on the kayak or go on a hike or go to a museum and you do these one-to-one things with kids, and then one day your daughter or granddaughter will look up at you and say, "Dad, I'd like to ask you a question about getting married." And Joan did. And with tears in her eyes and with mine, she looked up at me and promised that, "Dad, you're not going to have to worry about me. I'm going to do it right." And she did. Some other 3 neat kids that I'm going to hop on a plane and go see here in just a few minutes. It's sure been good to be with you. Bless your hearts. Go get them and be troublemakers in America, because there are a lot of people who just don't know what in the world is going on, and they just got it all backwards, and there's so much misinformation out there. Tell them like it is, and don't be an enabler in your office. You can tell kids in your office about gas masks and about the truth about the risks. And safer sex isn't safe. Teach them, your kids, your patients, about the safest sex, which is waiting to marriage, and then only sex in marriage. Thanks very much.